applying restorative practices. By this time, you have been working on virtue, but perhaps need help in understanding what to do when the same behaviors occur, and simply cultivating virtue is not enough. Restorative practices challenges us to hold relationships as the highest priority. So imagine that when you see a young person causing harm, that person is as valued and respected as the person being harmed. I believe that young people never give away more pain than they hold. So we can defend the receiver of harm first, but most importantly, we must stop the hurtful behavior. If you have posted the 4 guiding principles of VBRD around your building, then you will first consider your own virtue. Then direct the attention to these principles in challenging the harmer to consider which principle has been forgotten. And here is what we need to consider in addressing the behaviors. Restorative processes are designed for that purpose of creating an emotionally safe environment and allow the community to reap the full benefit by developing leadership, keeping everyone safe and productive. It will be easy to see the benefits of the restorative practices if you address issues in your buildings early and often. When students see fairness, they respond favorably, whether or not it seems tough. This is most important as we look at this arrow, this continuum. This shows the most basic ways of integrating restorative practices, making statements about how fairness affects you in working with students, to asking them questions such as, when you push people, what do you think they're thinking about you? By focusing on the informal end of the spectrum, the teachers can avoid the need for more serious intervention that pulls parents into the solution. Intervene early and often. According to the National Threat Assessment Center, when schools do this, they're less likely to intervene in more serious incidents of harm. The aim of restorative practices is to develop that community and manage the conflict and tensions by repairing harm, building relationships. This continuum identifies both proactive, or building relationships and developing the community, to the reactive, on the other end of the spectrum, where we're repairing harm and restoring relationships. Both of these approaches are part of restorative practices. Organizations and services that only use a reactive process without building the social capital or the relationships within the building are less successful than those that also employ the proactive approach. Research has found this to be true. If we look at this compass, it was established in 1992 by Dr. Nathanson, calling it the compass of shame, to illustrate the various ways that human beings react when they feel shame. Shame is when we use traditional practices to cause humiliation or detract from the good name God has given to a person. So when we react to those feelings of being isolated or someone's attack on our humanity, the 4 poles of this compass of shame indicate the behaviors associated. So I think many of us can reflect on having seen these things either in ourselves or in those around us. Withdrawal or isolating oneself, running and hiding. This happens quite often, and we find this in children especially who shrink back when they're reprimanded in traditional ways. Or attacking the self, putting themselves down or not seeing themselves as good. And this actually takes even more serious overtones of self-injury and basically poor self-esteem, as people would call it. But I believe it's a diminished sense of their dignity and worth. The other aspect of this is avoidance. This takes the form of denial. And this can also include abusing drugs and abusing alcohol, and thrill-seeking as a distraction. The other aspect to think about is attacking others, turning the tables. How many times has this happened when someone is called out on their poor behavior or their poor choices? They immediately want to blame someone else as being the root cause of the problem. So sometimes lashing out verbally or physically or blaming others is pretty common. So in the compass of shame, we're looking at withdrawal, attacking self, avoidance, or attacking others. Nathanson also goes on to say that attack and other responses is responsible for the proliferation of violence in modern life. Usually people who have adequate esteem readily move beyond their feelings of shame. So this is why it's important for us, rather than to focus on traditional forms of discipline, to focus on virtue. Restorative practices, by their very nature, provide the opportunity for us to express ourselves along with other emotions that we might be feeling in that moment, and in doing so, reduce their intensity. In restorative conferences, for example, people routinely move from negative affects through the natural affect to positive affects when they're done. It's powerful to witness this, and it's powerful to watch young people accepting of their role in the causes of harm and accepting of their role in solving things and making them as right as possible. And knowing when this is finished that they have returned to goodness and they have returned the sense of their good name, first to themselves, then to the community around them. When we work collaboratively to repair harm, there will be times when all involved students, their parents, teachers, and administrators work together to resolve issues. The people in the room doing most of the work, however, will be the students themselves. With our guidance, we can teach them this process. Circles are the foundation of communication. Setting regular meeting times is critical to building community, solving problems, and planning, whether planning an event, an activity, or planning a better future when there is harm. The central idea of fairness in the process is that individuals are most likely to trust and cooperate freely with systems, whether they themselves win or lose by those systems. When fair processes are observed, everyone wins. This circle represents the ongoing cycle we must commit to in BBRD. First, ongoing personal transformation as we discover the power of divine love, that perfect love only God reveals to us in so many ways each day. Once we connect with that deep love, then we choose actively to grow closer to God through the practice of virtue. That sets us up to see the world in a more positive way, free of judgments, criticism of others, and small-mindedness. We are changing in thought, word, and deed to be mindful of the great God-given dignity and honor worthy for ourselves and those around us, everyone we're in contact with. And in order to grow in our Christian walk, this must be an ongoing process. Next, we see the mutual agreements about forgiveness and reconciliation when there is harm, and that is accomplished through formation and service. The formation is the shaping of the will to conform with God's plan for goodness and use the outcome of the restorative process to integrate service. So, for instance, we can hold students accountable for the inappropriate language by having them post signs in the building about using kind words. Or we can have students use their mistakes to teach younger students about virtue that could help them avoid the problem in the future. When these things become second nature in a school building, it's hard to know whether they're just helping or they're actually restoring harm, repairing from an incident that has occurred. So it's important to think about the vibrancy that this will create in your building. Once we see inside the outer circle of love and virtue, then the inner circle helps students to do three things. First, identify the injustice. What went wrong? Second, restore equity, making sure that I've made things right. Fair does not necessarily mean equal. You can talk about this in your individual group discussions. And third, what can you guarantee about the future? Sometimes this would require a written agreement signed by all parties. Many times As I've mentioned before, the best response is a great question. Having someone say, now what did we agree to again? Let's recap. That way, students now are reminding themselves and everyone else involved what we've agreed to. For now, these are the ideas we want you to reflect on, so don't panic and think you have to run out and practice these things if you're new to VBRD especially. But do be thinking and doing that soul searching about them and the routine you and your school have in place currently. This is the underlying philosophy you can discover over time in working with antisocial behaviors. But it must always, always begin with love. When working in a mid to high level incident, the 3 key points of establishing the injustice, restoring equity, and providing a better future can be these 3 questions. What happened? So what about that? And now what? What will you do to make it better? The form here with the steps to restoration is a helpful guide, and you will need to determine when the behavior you address is an informal or a formal response. Look back over these slides as needed so you can begin forming ideas about ways to address specific behaviors. This is a good staff discussion guide, or would be good also for a parent group to talk about effective ways to approach discipline at home. For your reflection today, read this passage from Proverbs aloud and write your prayerful thoughts about what this passage is telling you about those who are being disciplined and those who provide it for them. Be prepared to share your thoughts with others. Thank you.